We are already getting nearby venues through the Foursquare API, more specific the search venue endpoint. We're getting into the application as a JSON, we're deserializing that JSON into objects, and we now have inside of the new travel page this venues variable which contains the list of all of the venues. Now that we have this, it's time for us to start listing them into the UI. So I am going to open the new travel page XAML file, and right below the entry that I have right now for the experience, I want to add a list view that is going to be displaying all of those venues that we have just retrieved. And it's inside of this list view where we're going to be doing something very similar to what we did in the history page. But in the history page, we used a text cell, a cell that is already created that allows us very easily to display text into that cell. But right now, we want a little bit more than just one text. Each of these rows is going to have to display the name of the venue, the category of the venue, and the distance of the venue, at least in my scenario. In your case, you can choose to display whatever you want. But because we are going to display a lot of information and maybe that information won't fit a text cell, because a text cell only has a couple of labels, then we're going to have to define our own cell. But the definition is going to be very similar. The list view is going to have a name. So I'm going to name this list view venue list view. It's going to have a horizontal options of fill and expand, so it uses the entire real estate of the screen from left to right. Inside of the list view, I'll still have to define the item template, and inside of it, I'll have to define a data template. Except this time, instead of defining a text cell like we did before, we're going to define a view cell. And we're going to be defining it like this. And we're going to have to define it like this because inside of the view cell is where we are going to define exactly how it is supposed to look. And we're going to be able to define whatever we want in here. I am going to start with a grid. And this means that I'll be able to define anything. The grid is another type of container, a little bit different to the stack layout, but it's going to work very similarly. We can define whatever element we want inside of this grid. Except that, contrary to what the stack layout does, it's not really going to stack the elements. But what we can do is define rows and columns inside of the grid, which makes it ideal for the scenario that I have in mind. I am going to need 2 columns and 2 rows. In the first column, I'm going to have the name for the venue. Right below it, in the first column, but in the second row, I want the category for this venue. And on the second column, still in the first row, I will want the distance for that venue. So we're basically going to be dividing this grid into 4, with 2 columns and 2 rows. And to do that, we're going to have to define first those columns. So I am going to write grid.column definitions like this, and inside I'm going to define 2 columns. And columns need to have a width. And width can be established in 3 ways. We can establish it with an asterisk, which means it's going to take all the width available. We can set it to a number as well, and we can set it to be auto, which means it's going to take the width of the elements inside of it to get its available width. This means that the second column is going to have a width applied depending to what the elements inside of it require, while the first column is just going to take all of the rest of the available space. And then I am going to define the rows. And very similar to the column definitions, I am going to define a row definition, but instead of width, I have to establish height. And I'm going to set both of these to an asterisk. This means that the available space will be divided into 2, and half of it is going to one row and the other half is going to the other. Having this rows definition, I can start defining what is going to be inside of the rows and the columns. For example, I can start by defining a new label. And if I don't specify the column or the row, it is going to be by default on column 0 and row 0. And this label is going to get its text from binding to the name property of the venue. And I'm going to style this label a little bit. For example, I can set the font attributes to be bold, so it looks a little bit bigger than the rest of the fonts. Then I want to define another label. In this case, I do want to change its row, because I still want it to be in the column 0, so I don't need to establish it because that's the default value, but I want this to be on the second row, on the row 1. Remember that we start counting from 0. So I can set this by writing grid.row and set it to 1. This means that this is going to be in a row right below this first label that I defined. In the case of this label, I am going to be bounding its text to location.address. And we'll take a look at this in just a second. And finally, we're going to define a third label, which is also going to need the definition of the column in this case, because this has to be in the second column, meaning the column 1. But I'm not going to have to change the row because I do want this to be on the first row, meaning the row 0, meaning the default row, so I don't need to establish it. And in this case, I am going to bound the text to location.distance, meaning that these elements are going to be getting their value from the location property that is inside of the venue and the address property that is inside of that location. And in the case of the third label, from the distance. The one that is very straightforward is the first one because it's getting the name, which is a property directly inside of the venue class. And finally, we have to set the item source for this list view. And we already have the variable that is going to be that source. So in the onAppearing, right after getting the venues, I can access the venue list view and set the item source to be this variable, venues. Now let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to use the Android simulator again, and apparently I have an error in line 35, which is this one. Indeed, I erased a curly bracket, and it has to be like this. So let's try this again. Here we have the application up and running. We can log in, navigate to that new travel page. We're going to have to set the location so the locator actually finds the user. And once it has found it and once it has requested everything, we can see the list itself. And notice that indeed we are displaying inside of a grid that we divided into 2 rows and 2 columns, the name in bold, the address, and the distance in meters. And notice how indeed we have most likely 30 elements inside of this list, which is the amount of elements that we have been retrieving from the service. Now, this doesn't look ideal, so I am going to head back to the definition of the list view, and I am going to add first some margin. I am going to add a margin of 20 and 0, just like this. So the margin of 20 is set to the left and to the right, and no margin to the top or to the bottom. Then I am going to change the text color for the second label, meaning the address label, which is going to be Dodger Blue. And then I'm going to set some format to this label so it displays an M of meters right by the distance. And for this, right after the binding, we're going to use something new. And notice that in all of this list, we have something that is called string format. And the string format can be set to something like this. I am going to add some single quotes in here. I'm going to write brackets like this, and I'm going to add a 0 in the middle. This looks very similar to what we did when generating the URL for the request. And then I'm just going to write meters at the end. So with this new formatting, let's run this one more time and take a look at the changes. Now I seem to have an error, and I think I have identified I forgot to add a comma in the margin. So I add a comma between the first value, that is going to be the left and right margin, and the second value, which is going to be the top and bottom margin. So again, try this. In the Android simulator, click on login, go to the new travel page by clicking on add. We have to set the location for this emulator. And once the elements are retrieved, we see that this has been established correctly. We see that there is now a margin to the right and to the left. We still see a bold font for the title or the name of the venue. But now we see Dodger Blue, or this blue for the address of the venue. And we see now that the value for the meters already is concatenating meters at the end. So we know a little bit more about what that is. So now you know how to create custom cells as well. We are now going to implement functionality for the user to select one of these elements and save it along with the experience, which means that we have to start by changing the model that we currently have for the post. That is what we are going to be doing in the next lecture.